question becomes, how come there's willful ignorance, right? How come ability to understand that there are so many different genealogists and ecologists actually come into the field with their own biases? So the book that I'm speaking about today is based off of the work of Dr. Joan Roughgarden. Dr. Joan Roughgarden is a trans woman who is an evolutionary biologist. And one of the points that she makes in her work is that ecologists and evolutionary biologists often take their human, social, and political prejudice as a way to describe their work. So, for example, one of the points she makes is that when species that actually have sex transitions are observed by ecologists and biologists, biologists will use words like cross-dresser or other pejorative words as a way to say that these animals are kind of a joke, or they will not seriously write about same-sex sexual activity that they witness. They'll just say, oh, they're playing, or they'll dismiss it. So they actually are taking their own homophobic and transphobic biases and willfully ignoring the genetic, gender, and sexual diversity that they see around them. Dr. Joan Roughgarden actually is something called an adaptionist biologist, and I'd love to explain what adaptionist biology is and why I think it's so powerful. So, as an adaptionist biologist, she says, her role as a biologist is not to pass judgment on nature, but rather to try to understand why there are phenomenon in the world. So, for example, a heteronormative biologist would look at animal species and try to come up with an explanation for why these people are deviating from straight cis sex acts. Whereas Dr. Joan Roughgarden says, no, my job as a biologist is to redefine my own paradigm, my own lens, my own research to accommodate what nature is naturally showing me. So then the question becomes, okay, if we believe that the goal of life is the propagation of a species, how is LGBTQ expression not a deviation from that goal, but aligned with that goal? So do you see the distinction there? An adaptionist biologist doesn't see LGBTQI expression as a deviation or a departure from the idea of reproducing a species, but rather asks, how are LGBTI expressions part of that larger project of reproducing a species? And this is the work that I am so invested in. In the same ways in which the debate around abortion creates this false binary of pro-life, pro-choice, where actually when people are talking about life, they're only talking about conception. They're not speaking about all the things that make life possible. What makes life possible? Caring for people, housing, cooking for people, protecting people. Life is not just about reproduction and the way that we define it. So actually, when we widen the field of what we mean when we say reproduction, we begin to understand that queer and trans people across species and queer and trans animals have actually always been involved in the processes of reproduction, regardless or not if they are participating in the sex act as it's defined. So if you learn anything about queer and trans history, especially in indigenous cultures across the world, queer and trans people were often involved as caretakers, and were often involved as teachers, and were often involved as medicine people or healers. So actually their existence was still part of the larger community survival and struggle. So what actually Joan Roughgarden is making us tease apart is, what do we mean when we say reproduction? And how can we expand our ideas of reproduction to actually accommodate the natural variation of LGBTQI expression that exists in the world? She doesn't cite this literature in her book, but I'd love to teach you it. There's a term called social reproduction. So social reproduction is a concept that comes from Marxist feminism, and I'd love to explain what that is and why it relates to this conversation around evolutionary biology. So Marx, you might have heard of him, his base unit of analysis of a theory of capitalism was a worker, and most often a factory worker. But a lot of Marxist feminists entered the chat and they were like, Marx, we agree with you, but your paradigm presumes a male subject. In a patriarchal world, oftentimes women were barred access to factory labor, but they're still working. And in fact, women's labor often is that which allows the male worker to be able to go to the factory. So even before the male worker is being exploited at the factory, the male worker is being fed by whom? The male worker is being babysat by whom? And so what Marxist feminists basically argued is that we invisibilize labor that's associated with women in a patriarchal system, when in fact that is real work and real labor. So some terms that they began to use were reproductive labor or social reproduction. So what social reproduction is all of the work that goes into the maintenance and the propagation of life, right? So social reproduction actually looks at things like culture, not as superfluous or ephemeral or excessive or redundant, but actually as necessary for the propagation of life. So what we can learn from Marxist feminists is that actually things that we diminish as not real or as ridiculous or superficial, we should interrogate what standards are being used to dismiss that as legitimate work. So like visibility by trans people is a form of labor, right? But it often doesn't get seen as such because in a trans-misogynist society, we're just seen as self-indulgent narcissists, not actually people who are engaged in political intellectual labor, right? That's why oftentimes the very grammar we have of labor, of resistance, of politics, often coheres around the experiences of white cis men. But the everyday acts of resistance of women and trans people, and especially women and trans people of color, is not seen as legit because it's not legitimated by systems of power and oppression, right? So what an analysis of social reproduction allows us to do is to expand our horizon of what we see as foundational to life and the propagation of life. So I'm using social reproduction here as a way to ask us to have a larger conversation, to say that when we dismiss LGBTQI people as not participating in reproduction, what kind of reproduction are we talking about? Because last time I checked, we're speaking about humans here. LGBTQ people have always created art, knowledge, fashion, culture, care work that made living possible. So that's why I think it's really important to bring up the conversation around abortion, is because when we're speaking about life, we have to actually argue that life is not just about conception. Life is about the actual everyday structures and institutions and acts of care and love that make living possible, right? Which means that if you're pro-life, you have to be anti-police brutality. If you're pro-life, you have to be global wealth inequality, because inequality actually is anti-life. Racism is anti-life, And so we can't let other people claim life and reproduction, because what we're actually arguing for foundationally is the proliferation of life and reproduction and the expansion of what those concepts can and should mean. So back to this idea of evolutionary biology. What Dr. Joan Roughgarden actually reminds us then is that it's not that LGBTQI expression in species is a deviation from what animals and humans are supposed to be doing. As adaptionist biologists, we have to ask, how is LGBTQI expression necessary for evolution? Does that make sense? So then, how are LGBTQI people necessary for evolution? Makes us realize one of the biggest paradigms that nature can teach us. And this is something that I really hope that you take away from this live, which is that actual diversity makes a species stronger. I'll say that again. Diversity makes a species stronger and more resilient. One of the things we can learn from evolutionary biology is that if a species all had the exact same genes and the exact same traits, it would be more easily conquered and die out. But actually, it's diversity that allows a species to live on. So that if there is a gene that can't respond to the environmental conditions, only a small group of people will die out, not the entire group, right? So what I need to argue, and it feels obscene to have to say this, is that gender and sexual diversity is essential for the propagation of life in community. So that means that it's not just that we need to include LGBTQ people because that's politically correct. That's base level. That's boring to me. We need to affirm LGBTQI expression because it's essential for the strength and resilience of humankind. Do you see the difference? So the framework then is that it's not that gender and sexuality are essential for humanity. It's that gender and sexual diversity is essential for ecology. Ecology. And that's where it's really important for LGBTQ people to actually learn science and learn environmental science, because nature templates, as Dr. Roughgarden says, a smorgasbord of possibilities. And what that means is that nature does not say that you should all be men or women, or you should all be straight. That's not nature speaking. That's culture speaking. What nature says is that ecologically, there are so many diverse plants and animals and ways of being, and that makes an ecosystem stronger and more resilient. So in the same ways that we learn that plant and animal diversity is essential, we need to bring that due diligence to humanity and say racial ability, gender and sexual diversity is actually essential for humanity. So ecology gives us a new paradigm that I think hits deeper than just political recognition. Political recognition isn't pushing far enough. So what political recognition says is affirm LGBTQ people because LGBTQ rights are human rights. Yes. But what I'm pushing for is affirm LGBTQ people because your life depends on it. Do you see the difference? In one paradigm, it's I'm supporting these people over there. In another paradigm, it's I'm going to die out. Like my life will not be as good unless I have LGBTQ diversity in my life. So that actually exhorts us to actually say that LGBTQI expression is essential for the betterment of society for all people, not just for LGBTQI people. And the reason that we show up for LGBTQI people is not because we want to support or protect them, but because, I mean, obviously, but we want to create a better humanity and ecosystem for all people. Okay, so that was my lecture on social reproduction, queer ecology, based off of Dr. Joan Roughgarden's Evolution's Rainbow. Check out my most recent book report, Nature is Queer. I'm taking donations today. All tips are going towards supporting the humanitarian crisis in India right now. Many people are dying without access to oxygen. Mass cremations are happening all across India. I've had family members die. Many of my friends there are sick right now. It's so important when we're speaking about ecology and the interconnectivity of everything to remember that like what happens in India also is impacting us here. That's a false distinction. So whatever we can give in this time, and please raise visibility of what's happening and make sure that we try to get vaccines in the global south and challenge this vaccine apartheid and make sure that everyone in the world has access to vaccines regardless of their class or their caste or their geography. Okay, I'm going to take some questions really quickly before peacing out. For some books on Marxist feminism, I would really read Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici. That's a kind of foundational text that could be really helpful for you. Where can I get this book? I have a link in my bio to Evolution's Rainbow. Could you elaborate as to how gender and sexual diversity are important for ecology and evolution? Absolutely. Okay. So when we say, there's a really interesting point in Dr. Roughgarden's book where she says across species, there are so many animals that are having sex, not just for birth. And actually, she says, if all of us were just having sex for birth, we would have a crisis of too many people with too few resources. And so one of the points she makes is that sex can't just be thought of as for birth. There are other forms that sex has, other roles that sex has in special diversity. So yeah, it's sad that Federici's most recent book has trans-exclusionary ideas, and we can talk about that when I review her, I think in the next few months. But this idea that sex doesn't have to actually be for birthing, that it can be for camaraderie, it can be for building collaboration, it can be for building kinship. One of the points that she makes in the book that I think is so powerful is she says we grow up with this narrative, survival of the fittest, as if that's synonymous with Darwin. But if you've attended my lectures, I've taught so many times, Darwin never coined survival of the fittest. That was actually created by Herbert Spencer, a white supremacist eugenicist. Darwin didn't believe in survival as a fittest as a framework. So competition got reinscribed as the dominant framework for how species interact. But actually, there's so much evidence for mass collaboration between species. So we take our political system of colonial capitalism and we filter how animals are relating to each other to be like, oh, they must be fighting, they must be competing. And we ignore the incredible demonstrations of mutual aid and collaboration and support. That's not to say there's not competition. Of course there is. But that is to say that where there's competition, there's also collaboration. And so what's important to understand is that when we have a more elastic understanding of the role of sex in species, we can begin to think about how are people creating collaborative economies, trust, kinship networks, friendship, that actually allow people and animals, we're talking about species here, to show up and defend one another. And then in the book report itself, I have examples of different animals and their reproductive systems, and you can learn there about each specific animal, why their intersex expressions or their queer expressions actually are essential for the propagation of those individual species, right? Because part of understanding sort of this diversity is queer and trans expression, and I use those words lightly because those are still human terms, serves a different function across different species. And so each species actually has a different relationship to what sex and reproduction means for it. Okay, I'm going to see if there's any final questions I'm going to answer, and then I will go. So some more questions about social reproduction theory and Marxist feminism. I definitely have some books scheduled to review that are some books on feminist economics, and I will do those soon to help break down those concepts. Those ideas have been so foundational to my life, so it'll be very exciting to share with you all. Okay, I'll take one final question. Just put it in the question section if you have it. Okay, someone says, my teacher says that hormone therapy for trans people isn't natural and that it causes harm to the body. I obviously said it's false, but I don't know if you have any point related to nature. Well, thank you for saying that it's false. There's so many points that I can answer and address that question from. The first one is, we don't get to tell one another what to do with our bodies. So this is a term called concern trolling, which is often levied against people with disabilities or fat people, is people saying, we know what's best for your health, so you should do this. And it cloaks itself as benevolent and as kind and helpful, but actually it's obnoxious because it's not your body. So why is that even a debate? Because it's someone else's body, right? So what people want to do with their own bodies should not be held to some standard of like health as you define it. The second point there is the use of the word natural. Notice that what your teacher is doing in that moment was taking an individual political prejudice and disguising it using the word of nature as a way to legitimize it. So often the ways that discrimination against trans and intersex people operates is people using the discourse or the language or the rhetoric of nature as a way to disguise their insidious prejudice as just a matter of science or medical truth. But when you actually ask those people, what medical knowledge are you using to make this claim, they don't really have those claims. And when you consult with the experts, endocrinology societies, pediatric societies, medical officials across the world say, no, hormone therapy is not what is harmful. What is harmful is transphobia. What is harmful is actually denying people their bodily autonomy. That's what's harmful, right? And so it's really important that when people make claims, especially around health and medicine, we recognize that what they're often doing is trying to disguise their own personal prejudice using medicine and science as a sheen, as a smokescreen. And this is particularly the case with fat people, right? Because so much of the lesson and the priming that we've had around fatness is wrong and incorrect. We conflate being thin with being healthy and being fat with being unhealthy, even though health is not about what we look like externally at all. And then the final point that I would make around the hormone stuff is double standards. Is that cis people often, someone's saying this in the comments, undergo hormone replacement therapy, and it's not seen as a problem, it's seen as medically necessary. But then when trans people desire hormone replacement therapy, it's seen as wrong or incorrect. So we should also look for the double standards, right? And the double standards are often where LGBTQ bias exists. Ask yourself, would I say this about a white cis straight man? No, why not? It's because we afford infinite complexity to dominant groups in society, whereas marginalized groups are held to an extreme standard, which ultimate goal is about delegitimizing our existences. Okay, thank you so much everyone for tuning in. And to the 86 of you who donated, collectively we've raised $240, which I'm going to be matching. So it would be amazing if we could raise a little bit more and send over maybe $600 to support the humanitarian crisis in India right now. Like I mentioned, I've been posting about this every day in my stories and occasionally on my feed. Some of the highest rates of infection for a COVID-19 crisis right now are happening in India. And the entire world is looking away, and it's really not okay. India produces some of the most vaccines in the world, but these were being shipped abroad and not actually prioritized for local people. And global north countries are hoarding up these vaccines rather than actually making them and liberating them for people in the global south. And this is not just for India, this is people in Latin America, this is people in Brazil, people all over deserve access to these vaccines. And while it's obviously important for us in the United States to have access to them, it's really not okay that we live in a system where people's life or death is incumbent on money and that we've privatized a healthcare system when in fact this should be accessible to all people. So your support means a lot. Oh, wow. So many donations just came in. Thank you so much. Wow. Because so many donations came in, I'm just going to keep on answering some Q&A questions, because this is going to make a huge impact to support the crisis in India right now. And I'll be posting some more things in my story if you'd like some other places to donate to in my story. I'll answer one more question before heading out then. Any other readings on queer environmentalism? Yes, I have a bookshelf on my Goodreads on ecology, and that has some more books there. Okay. Awesome. I don't see any more questions there. Together, yes, buying badges is donation. I'll take all the proceeds to India. Gosh, you are all being so generous. Thank you so much. I don't want to go because we're doing such great work together. I'll answer this question then. How can someone explain to a parent that they are non-binary or trans if their parent doesn't understand but loves them? Okay, that's a really great question. We can use love as a really great access point to have difficult conversations. So it can be about saying, I know that you love me and you care about my happiness. I wanted to let you know what makes me most happy is expressing myself in this way. Here's how I would like to be called. Here's how I'd like to dress. Here's what to do with my body. So notice in how what I'm templating there is that we don't get hung up on the political vocabulary or the words, because those may isolate people who might not understand yet, right? Obviously, they need to understand over time. But if we're talking about preliminary conversations with people, oftentimes foregrounding the language of mental health, like happiness and love, establishes kind of intimacy with people and trust, where you can actually say, this is who I am, and it lands and resonates. I think people get really intimidated oftentimes when we come in guns blazing with all of words that they may not be familiar with. And I think this is especially the case for non-English speaking communities who might feel isolated when we come in saying words like gender non-conforming, right? We have to find ways to do this work of translation, and I think emotion can be a really powerful way to do translation work. And always foregrounding our vulnerability. And I know that can be really hard, but if you really feel like your parent loves you, then you should be able to be vulnerable with them. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Gosh, there's so much I want to say. Yes, my Goodreads is in my Instagram bio. Okay, final question I'm going to address, and then I'm really going to go. And I know it's at this point become a parody, because I began these being like 20 minutes, and then it's like 1 hour later. But we're doing such powerful work. We've already raised $440 that I'm going to be donating immediately right after to support relief efforts in India. And then in my stories, I'll put some links to donate to other places and spread the word. Okay, so the final question that someone asked is about the relationship between body hair and feminine clothing. And I'm going to try my best to connect that question to today's lecture on queer ecology, right? Okay, so what's really important to understand is that this equation of hairlessness with femininity is a cultural conception, not a biological fact. So there are plenty of people who are designated female at birth who are hairy. And this should not be controversial. Why is it that we're comfortable with hair on men and not hair on women and femmes? Is not because of biology, it's because of politics and culture. And when we really want to get into it, actually, there are people who are women that have a wide-ranging distribution of hormone levels. So we often, in this culture, police everyone into two categories, male and female, even though biologically, most people demonstrate characteristics that are traditionally masculine and feminine in the same body. So actually, when we're doing this work of saying that hairlessness is femininity, we are erasing the fact that there are so many women that naturally have body hair. Then the next point there is how that intersects with being trans or being queer. There's this very strange way in which we as trans feminine people are held to 1950s gender norms. People say that unless we look like the most traditional white hetero woman, then our womanhood or femininity is not valid. And that is ridiculous. Like, actually, there's as many ways to be a woman as there are women. And that's how it connects to what I was teaching you about queer ecology. Diversity makes us stronger. So any kind of political rhetoric that's about women need look like this, women need be hairless, women need be thin, women need be cis, women need be gender conforming, is anti-ecology, because what I've taught you today is that ecology is an argument for the power of diversity. So actually, the more diversity we have in the category woman, the stronger woman is. And that mode of thinking unravels so much of the toxicity of Western culture, because Western culture has taught us that someone else's shine diminishes our shine. It's taught us that there's scarcity and everything is a zero-sum game. So if someone is different from us, that challenges who we are as a person. But actually, what I'm teaching you is that our differences make us stronger as a species and a society. So when our differences make us stronger, when I see you being hairy, that doesn't challenge me. I'm like, that's awesome. You're your own kind of beautiful. You're your own kind of woman. You're your own kind of body. So ecology, for me, is one of the most beautiful and resonant and poetic alternatives to the scarcity mentality of Western colonial capitalism. So Western colonial capitalism teaches us that there's a finite number of resources. There's a finite amount of legitimacy. There's a finite amount of beauty to be had. And that if someone is living their best life, that's somehow a challenge to us. But what ecology actually teaches us is, okay, you live your best life. That's going to make me live my best life too. So, wow, I just linked femininity and body hair to queer ecology. Go me. Okay, I'm truly going to log off in a second, but I just wanted to update people that we have 168 donations. We've almost at 500, and I'm matching donations, so that means that we're almost at 1,000, which is amazing. Can we reach 1,000 to donate to support the humanitarian crisis right now in India, with COVID-19 infections being highest in the world? So many people are dying, and this money is going to go a long way to supporting people. So thank you so much, everyone, for your support. It's so exciting today that we're going to be able to donate $1,000. That's awesome. We have 28 more bucks to go to 500, and then I will match that. Oh, wow. Someone is asking a really philosophical... Oh my gosh, we reached 500. Woo! Thank you, everyone. That means that we're going to be able to donate 1,000. Thank you. I am going to answer this last philosophical question, and then I'm going to peace out. Okay, so someone asked if an understanding of queer ecology challenges our investment in humanism. And I would love to break down these concepts for people, right? And I really want to make this clear. If this is one of your first lectures that you've attended, I don't shame people for not understanding complicated ideas or words. In this space, it's totally for learning. So you can always put questions in the question section and I will get to them. Okay, so humanism reinscribes the idea that humanity is the ultimate peak of what we should be aiming for. So, for example, human rights. You might hear this concept over and over again. LGBTQ rights are human rights, and that the goal is about spreading human rights. But I don't think that actually pushes far enough, because what about things that are not human but still need dignity and justice? And this is where so many indigenous peoples across the world have presented an alternative to human rights. Like, for example, there are many tribes across the world who give political voice to water or to land, and understand that land and water and animal and plant life also should have a role in decision making. So what humanism often ends up doing is prioritizing the human species over all other species. So we're okay with mass pollution for short-term profit, even though that's killing animal and plant life, right? So what we need to start being able to do with ecology is actually think about justice at a multi-species level. How do we not buy into this idea that progress or rights for humans have to mean putting down the environment or putting down animal and plant life? How can we actually see justice and rights for humans as part of a larger goal of creating a more beautiful, healthy world for all animals and plants? And I don't think that that's impossible. I think that the leadership has to belong to indigenous peoples who have been practicing this for thousands of years. So often when we say something is impossible, what we're actually doing is saying impossible from our paradigm, which is a paradigm influenced by Western colonial capitalism. But there are other paradigms that give us other approaches on how to do this work. So when we center the leadership of indigenous peoples, like, for example, with the mass fires that were happening in Australia last year, there was a really important conversation about how Aboriginal peoples in Australia actually were the original stewards of the land who worked with selective burning in the forest to prevent these mass fires. But part of the violence of settler colonialism was that Aboriginal people were not able to do that work around fire control. And so the solution to those fires is not just about putting out the fire, it's about actually giving leadership to indigenous peoples who understand the sacred practices of controlled burning, which actually creates a kind of ecosystem that is better and more inhabitable for all people, right? I could talk about this forever, but what I'm hearing is a lot of interest in environmental studies and ecology. So I'm definitely going to try to put out some more books about ecology. I have some really great texts in mind that I'd love to speak about on here. Okay, everyone, I'm really going to peace out now. It's time to get out of this hair, which has so much gel, and my facial makeup. I need to wipe it off. But thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Collectively, we are going to be donating $1,000 to support humanitarian relief right now with the COVID crisis in India. If you'd like to continue donating, I will post some more links in my stories. Okay, everyone. Thank you.